coming tonight. I'm very, very happy to be here. It's been a long day for me. I got up at 4:30 in Wisconsin to make my flight. My voice gives out. Bear with me. What you're about to see are a series of photographs, and I've got it arranged so that you'll get a new image every minute, about 50 images. So I'm hoping to come out even. I don't know if I will or not, but the images you will see are not directly tied to what I'm talking about, so it'll be kind of like a tennis match where we go about that. That's okay. Pictures of all okay. Let me begin with the first group of immigrants that came. They were mostly male. 7,500 of them who came between 1903 and 1905. And because they were mostly male, there were hardly any females along for them to marry. And this imbalance was rectified to a certain extent beginning in 1909 or 10 through 1924 when picture brides, about 1,000 of them, came to Hawaii. The origins of the picture bride phenomenon can be traced in the gentleman's agreement between the United States and Japan in 1908, which did permit entry to family members, not laborers. When Japanese picture brides began arriving in Hawaii, the possibility of arranging a similar system for Koreans arose. So the term picture bride or picture marriage, that's sajin kyohon in Korean, refers to the exchange of photographs of the prospective bride and groom through an intermediary. After assent by both sides and the payment of appropriate fees by the groom, the woman would travel to Hawaii to be married at the immigration station to a man whom she had never seen before except in a picture. It's not clear exactly how the system for Koreans began or who the first picture bride actually was, because there are several varying accounts, all of which are different. If we don't know the exact origins of the picture bride system in Korea, we do know that most of the picture brides by far came from Gyeongsang-do, that is in Southeast Korea. And while it's not entirely clear where most of the picture brides came from Gyeongsang-do, that province did suffer the most severe dislocations after 1910, when the imposition of Japanese colonial rule resulted in the dispossession of many Koreans from their land. Those who had lost their land could not readily find work in an urban industrial sector, since industrialization had not yet begun in Korea. While many of the unemployed men went to Japan when an economic boom associated with the First World War created demand for workers, women, by contrast, seized the opportunity to go to Hawaii. There were four groups that potentially stood to benefit from the picture bride system: the men who would obtain wives, the women who would obtain husbands, the intermediaries who would realize the profit, and the Hawaiian sugar planters. Several writers erroneously assert that the picture bride phenomenon was initiated by sugar plantation managers who were grappling with the unruly behavior of the Korean national community. That is, the plantation owners supposedly encouraged the importation of picture brides as a means of settling down the Koreans and transforming them into better, more stable sugarcane workers. Unlike the sponsorship of Christian mission work on the plantations, there is no evidence that the planters encouraged picture brides as a matter of official policy. It's probably true that they welcomed such a development under the assumption that family men would make better, more stable workers. But if the planters had hopes that the importation of picture brides would stem the exodus of Koreans from the plantations, they were sadly mistaken. Rather, the arrival of picture brides tended to hasten the already rapid departure of Koreans from the plantations to the city. The benefit to the men, of course, was that the picture bride system offered a modicum of normal family life in Hawaii now that it was apparent that they would not soon return to a Korea rent both by domestic chaos and by Japanese domination. Moreover, the initiation of the picture bride system just 5 years after the cessation of immigration of the men in 1905 is yet another indicator that Koreans had quickly made the transition from sojourner to settler, realizing that their future lay in Hawaii rather than Korea. This conclusion is supported by the fact that the return rate to Korea after 1910, the year which saw simultaneously the ending of Korean independence by Japan and the beginning of the picture bride system to Hawaii, was negligible. The motivations and characteristics of the women in Korea who became picture brides were not much different from those of the men who had arrived in Hawaii between 1903 and 1905. Like many of the men, the women were fleeing poverty and were attracted to the supposed riches that awaited them in Hawaii. Also, like the men, many of the women were in some way connected with Christianity. Yet another similarity was their youth, with the majority of the picture brides being 17 to 24 years old, although there were some as young as 15 or as old as 40. There were also differences. One significant difference was that while the earlier, mostly male immigrants had been primarily urban residents from all over the peninsula, the picture brides were primarily rural residents from southeastern Korea. It also appears that, with some exceptions, the picture brides were relatively uneducated, the result of the traditional Confucian belief that women did not require a formal education. Like the male immigrants who preceded them, most of the picture brides were attracted by the wealth that they believed awaited them in Hawaii. As often as not, these views were wildly unrealistic. Quote, I heard in Korea that Hawaii was a paradise. People spoke of clothing that grew on trees, free to be picked, and the abundance of fruits and all kinds of foods. Money, they said, was not necessary for survival and could be saved for future use. I heard only of prosperity and wealth in the islands, unquote. Such unrealistic expectations of wealth were fanned by the intermediaries, just like the recruiters who had lured their husbands-to-be a decade or so earlier. One matchmaker told some prospective picture brides, quote, if you marry these men, it will bring you and your family a great fortune. Another one said, quote, this man told me to expect to see money growing on every tree. My eyes were dreamy. I believed him because he said everybody in Hawaii was rich, unquote. Another go-between said that there would be so much food that we'd never be hungry. That stuck in my mind. On the farm, there was never enough to eat, unquote. While economic betterment was the most salient factor in explaining the exodus of picture brides from Korea to Hawaii, some of the picture brides had other motives for going. For some, it was their association with Christianity. For others, they wanted to escape Japanese domination. One woman recalled, quote, people can't talk, can't walk around. Under the Japanese, no freedom, not even free talking, a very hard time, unquote. Another one said, quote, Japanese I know want. They take over Korea. They take all metal bowls and chopsticks. In Korea, everybody no get money, unquote. A few of the women who had some education and possessed the heightened expectations of liberated women sought to escape the traditional limitations placed upon women in Korea and explore new horizons. One said, quote, she had never wanted to marry a peasant boy from the other side of the hill, unquote. Others wanted to escape the oppression which awaited women in a society still largely governed by Confucian precepts. These included the strict segregation of the sexes, arranged marriages, the propensity of husbands to take concubines, wife-beating, and domination by one's mother-in-law. As one woman recalled, quote, that time girls in my village can't walk even 10 miles outside, unquote. Another woman who had endured a marriage arranged by her parents said, quote, "I was already married to a man younger than myself. We were not poor, but my husband had a concubine and he spent every night out drinking. So I decided to run away to Hawaii." One matchmaker who recognized that escape from in-laws can be a selling point told the prospective picture brides, One matchmaker who recognized that escape from in-laws can be a selling point told prospective picture brides, quote, "If you marry here, you become a slave to your husband and his parents until you die. In Hawaii, nobody bothers you." There were hurdles to be overcome to become a picture bride, not the least of which was securing parental permission, especially that of the father who headed the household and who was accustomed to determining who and when his daughters would marry. To be fair, many of these women were still teenagers, whose parents in any society, Confucian or not, still needed to exercise some parental authority. Here's what one woman said, quote, "About 2 weeks before I have to leave for Hawaii, I tell my father and mother. My father was very angry," unquote. Mothers also opposed their daughters going to Hawaii. Here's what one said to her mother, quote, "If I marry someone here in Hawaiian, what is my chance to find a man with wealth and a good reputation? As you know, being a daughter of a poor family with little education, I will repeat the same hardship you have gone through. So try to see my marriage in a positive way." Another hurdle was Confucian tradition, the same hurdle that many of the original male immigrants had to surmount. In a Confucian society, to desert one's parents as they become elderly and require care is unfilial behavior. Some picture brides were chastised by older women in the community. Quote, "Can't you find a decent man in your village? It is an unpardonable sin to cause heartache to your old parents and have them miss you until they are buried. They will never close their eyes when they die," unquote. However, the brides-to-be, quote, "did not seem to pay attention to the typical scoldings they had heard so many times." Unquote. There's also something unseemly about the business of picture marriage. One local Japanese newspaper in Korea ran a story entitled, "Lee Young-ok sold to Hawaii for money," unquote. One woman made her arrangements in secret. Quote, "I made it secretly because that time me going to Hawaii alone is just like girls selling," unquote. Another picture bride endured the following. Quote, "There were tears and large wailing at the shocking news. Insuk was accused of selling herself for prostitution, of having disgraced the family. No member of their clan would ever be able to face the community or hold their heads up." Some of the go-betweens actively went around searching for picture brides, while others simply waited for potential picture brides to come to them. Some of the go-betweens were male, some were female. All seemed to be well-dressed. Some were relatives of Koreans already in Hawaii. Others had gone to Hawaii and had returned to Korea. Sometimes the young women initiated the process by seeking out a go-between. Quote, "There was a man from Chunju from Hawaii. A number of us decided to visit him. We met him at the home of Pastor Kim. We hardly dared look directly at him with his smartly dressed Western clothes. You were all very pretty," he said. "You can become picture brides," unquote. Sometimes the matchmaker in Korea took the initiative by seeking out young women directly. Here's one conversation with a female go-between. "Girl, are you Jinju Halani?" Woman, "Yes." Girl, "Grandma, I am only 15. Can I still marry?" Woman, "Why not? Although you are 15 years old, you look at least 18. Moreover, you are pretty. Whoever takes you is a lucky man. The woman told her that many Korean girls were going to Hawaii to marry Korean men who were making a good living. Sometimes the matchmakers went to the families first, knowing the powerful role of the parents, and used the familiar promise of riches to persuade the family. One painted glowing pictures of how prosperous these men were and how they move in circles with other wealthy men of position and prestige. The entire transaction, of course, centered around the exchange of photographs. Typically, the matchmaker brought along a Japanese photographer who took pictures of the girls dressed in their hanbok, their names and ages written on the back of the pictures. The men's photography, however, would be a different story. The men in Hawaii had to have pictures taken of themselves, and this posed a certain dilemma. First of all, the men were usually at least twice as old as the teenage brides they were contracting for, making them approximately the age of the women's fathers. Second, the rigors of sugar plantation work had exacted a toll on the physiques of many of the men, making them look even older than they really were. Third, long hours in the subtropical sun had given the men a deep suntan, which would hardly prove attractive to women whose ideal of genteelness was a fair, pale complexion rather than a burnished, peasant-like face. Fourth, few of the men were well off economically, and poverty was unlikely to fetch a young lady from Korea. To combat these four problems of age, a stooped posture, a deep suntan, and meager wages, the men had somehow to conceal these defects. The men would often rent or borrow a suit to give the impression of wealth. Some would, in addition, have their picture taken in front of the plantation manager's house, or the house of the person for whom they worked, implying it was their house. Perhaps a picture would be taken with the prospective groom's foot resting casually on the running board of a Model T, to give the impression that he was the car's owner. Others would apply talc to their dark faces to project the pale skin of an upper-class professional. Still others had the photographer touch up the photos to make the subject appear younger and or less suntan. And still others sent photos taken years earlier. The women in Korea had an inkling of some of these subterfuges employed by the prospective grooms. In one instance, a woman was concerned because her prospective groom had his picture taken in the sitting position, raising the fear in her that he was in some way incapacitated. In theory, both parties had a choice as each would peruse photographs of the opposite sex. Yet in practice, the system worked such that the one who chose first had the advantage over the one chosen, who could then only accept or reject. Sometimes the men got to choose first. One matchmaker in Korea told the prospective picture bride that, quote, "When I come back to see you, I will bring the pictures of your future husbands and money," unquote. In one case, on the back of the picture written to one girl was written in pencil, quote, "My name is Chung Bo-un, and I am 42 years old. I picked the young oak," unquote. Understandably, the young oak was taken aback by the age of her prospective husband. "Jinju Grandma," she said, "how come I was matched with a 42-year-old man?" The matchmaker replied, quote, "According to the letter of my broker in Honolulu, Mr. Chung is the best of the three men. The broker thought that Mr. Chung deserved the best picture bride, so he gave Mr. Chung the first choice, and he picked you from the three pictures. Not only is he a good man, but he also has quite a bit of money." The matchmaker concluded, quote, "I know the men are old, but old husbands know how to treat their wives right." Sometimes women got to choose first. One woman recalled he, the matchmaker, rummaged through his pocket and pulled out pictures of men. They ranged from very young to very old, from handsome to ugly, from thin to fat. Here's what she said: "If you will pick from these photographs the man you would like to marry, I will take your picture to him." Having been chosen rather than doing the choosing was naturally just as disconcerting to the men as it was to the women. One man asked, quote, "If my wife is fat and ugly, can I send her back?" Unquote. The agent glared at him and scolded, quote, "Our work is serious," unquote. We didn't know if he meant that no fat girls would be sent. Once agreement had been reached by both sides, the men had to come up with preparation money. At a minimum, this would total slightly over $100 and included traveling expenses for the bride, around $70, the commission for the marriage broker, about $30, and photography expenses, about $20. Yet many accounts suggest that the actual amount required was usually much higher. The most common figure seems to be in the neighborhood of $300 to $400, which is quite a sum at the time. And to raise such funds, the men sometimes had to resort to the gang to raise the money. Rotating Credit Association. There were three reasons why such a large sum was sometimes necessary. The first reason is that some of the marriage brokers were crooked and swindled the men by charging them for non-existent expenses. The second reason for the large sums was that the men wanted to convince their prospective brides in Korea that they were indeed well off, so they would not change their minds and refuse to come to Hawaii. One man sent $850. A third reason for the large sums was that oftentimes the men bribed the marriage broker either to ensure first choice from among a group of prospective brides' photographs or to ensure that he was matched with a pretty girl. That is, the more money one paid, the younger and prettier the wife would be. Insurance of the sort. Once that was taken care of, she would apply for a Japanese passport, and I think you saw the Japanese passport up there a few slides ago. Once she received the passport, she would then apply for a visa to the United States at the American consulate. Here's a scene at the immigration station at the wharf in Honolulu, because it was at this point that many of the women came to feel that they had been deceived. Most of the picture brides had come to Hawaii expecting to marry young and vigorous men of considerable means and to enjoy comfortable lives. These unrealistic expectations began to unravel at the immigration station when they met their husbands-to-be for the first time. The men who were waiting for them were almost invariably poor, older, stooped, wrinkled, and deeply suntanned. Accounts by the picture brides themselves confirmed the feeling of betrayal at the hands of their new husbands, who had sent bogus photographs of themselves. Quote, "My husband sent his 25-year-old handsome-looking picture. He came to the pier, but I see he's really old-looking. He was 45 years old, 25 years more old than I am. My heart stuck. I was so disappointed, I don't look at him again." Unquote. Another one said, quote, "When I first saw my fiancé, I could not believe my eyes. His hair was gray, and I could not see any resemblance to the picture I had. He was a lot older than I imagined." Unquote. And the third one said, quote, "When I see him, he's skinny and black. I know like. No look like picture, but no can go home." Unquote. Some of the picture brides could see their intended husbands from the deck of the ship and were so shocked that they refused to leave the ship and begged the crew to take them back to Korea. But the crew knew that the brides did not have the return passage, so they were forced off the ship and led into the immigration building, some crying, quote, "Mother, mother, take me home, take me home." Unquote. Here's how it would work. The groom, who had recently arrived from one of the outer islands, where he had worked on a plantation, would go to the immigration station to claim his bride-to-be. In a borrowed car, they would drive to a local Korean inn, where they would check into a special corner room reserved for just such occasions. After checking in and having a Korean meal, they went shopping in the city. After 2 nights at the inn, on the third day, the groom brought the bride a bouquet, and they got married at the Korean Methodist Church. The groom gave her a gold wedding band costing about $7. That evening there was a banquet at the Korean restaurant. They honeymooned for 10 days on the island of Oahu before boarding the ferry back to the outer island where they would be living. That's how it was supposed to go. Oftentimes it didn't go that smoothly. Most of the women were still in a state of shock over the age, appearance, and financial condition of their betrothed husbands when they reached the Korean run-in in Honolulu. The innkeepers of these Korean inns were eyewitness to the traumatic scenes which were often played out in front of them. Quote, there were many Korean picture brides who did nothing but cry day and night from the moment they checked into the inn. Even after the crying phase, some wouldn't speak a word for days. They would emerge only to eat. Only the men's threat to deport the girls back to Korea forced them to marry the men they came for. Another Korean innkeeper recalled, quote, usually the disappointed brides would desperately fight back the husbands who try to approach them. Sometimes we have to break into the rooms when we think the couple has become too violent. Unquote. One bride to be remembered when she checked in, quote, I don't eat and only cry for 8 days. I don't eat nothing, but at midnight when everybody sleeps, I sneak out to drink water so I don't die. I was so angry at my cousin because she arranged the marriage. In the first of what would be several major adjustments, most of the women went ahead and married their intended husbands, despite their deep disappointment, feeling that they had no other choice. Not only did they lack money for the return passage, but also a return to Korea would involve too much of a ransom face. Another one decided to marry her 46-year-old intended husband because she felt sorry for him. Of course, the men were aware that their new brides were disappointed. Second major adjustment for the newly arrived brides was the living arrangements and economic circumstances in which they now found themselves, especially those whose husbands still worked on the sugar plantations. Many of the picture brides had been led by the marriage brokers and their future husbands to believe that a comfortable life awaited them in Hawaii. Not be the case. For example, one picture bride was met by her new husband wearing the exact same clothes and shoes that he had worn when he arrived from Korea 20 years earlier. And his palm was as hard as a rock, quote, not the soft hands of a scholar or official. The hard life into which many of the picture brides now entered was reflected in their living accommodations. Quote, my first stove was a tin can with a hole cut out for the pot, and my home was constructed of wooden slats which offered no privacy at night when the lights were on. Another bride found that their new home was, quote, worse than the servants' quarters back in Daegu. There was only one room to cook, sleep, and entertain. The floor was bare wood. What was even worse for the picture brides was that their husband expected them to work as well. One woman complained that I have to take in washing and ironing for unmarried men, and a baby keeps coming every year, unquote. I cried many nights, but soon I gave up, said another one. The third one said, I found the situation quite to the contrary of what I had expected. I decided to work since I had heard that my husband had spent 1 month of his earnings on our wedding. When I told my husband of my intentions to work, he was not surprised at all, but seemed to have expected it all along. It was very hard work for me. I arose at 4, cutting sugar canes, watering, and pulling out weeds. Most of the picture brides were too ashamed to inform their families in Korea of the reality of their hard lives in Hawaii. Quote, I did not want to have to lie about the rough life I was leading, unquote. And since returning to Korea was not a realistic option, the predominant response on the part of the picture brides was to do whatever was necessary to better their financial status and working and living conditions. For most, this meant going to work. But for most couples on the plantation, the increased pressure for better working and living conditions caused by the arrival of picture brides led them to leave plantation work completely and move to the city, accelerating a pattern which had already begun before the arrival of picture brides. Many of the men were prompted by the Japanese strike of 1920 on Oahu to come to that island with their new brides as strike breakers, and then, when the strike ended, to stay in or near Honolulu and pursue other lines of work. For most couples, their new living and working situation represented a joint effort, approximating the notion of equality in the marriage.
To be sure, there were a few men who took advantage of the new brides. Here's what one said, quote, "My mother, because of her training at the Bible Institute, was able to earn a few dollars a day working in a tailor shop. My father, being the scholarly type, was content to be supported thus and made little effort to look for jobs." End quote. The grooms also had adjustments to make. The imminent arrival of a bride from Korea caused many husbands to abandon the plantation for the city. This occurred because the men knew that the women would not be happy on the sugar plantations, and because the men had represented themselves as up-and-coming success stories that would not square with plantation work. While waiting for the ship carrying their future wives to arrive from Japan, some of the men landed new jobs in and around Honolulu so they would not have to return to the plantation. So if the sugar planters had entertained hopes that the arrival of the picture brides after 1910 would contribute to Korean stability, they were mistaken, as plantation hopping and leaving the plantation altogether increased rather than decreased with the arrival of the picture brides. For those men who had already moved to the city, many scrambled to upgrade their living circumstances when they learned that their brides were en route. Another adjustment with which the picture brides were faced came with their entry into a Korean community that was intensely anti-Japanese. Since the picture brides had come from Korea after it had been annexed by Japan in 1910, a number of them could speak Japanese. There was one instance where a Korean picture bride spoke Japanese to a Japanese greengrocer, and their anti-Japanese husbands objected to their use of Japanese. This one husband was telling his new Japanese-speaking bride not to speak Japanese anywhere, under any circumstances, even to the Japanese, or he would send her back to Korea. Yet another important adjustment, which the men had already made and which now faced the newly arrived picture brides, was the often strange and new American customs and diet. In some cases, the husband had to assume the role of teacher in matters such as Western table manners. Quote, "When you eat soup, you are not supposed to make a noise. Chew your food with lips closed." End quote. Later, as the picture brides encountered more abstract values such as equality, independence, and individualism, they found that these would conflict with the more traditional expectations still extant in the Korean community in Hawaii. One such traditional expectation was the necessity of the picture bride to conform to the proper role befitting a Korean woman and wife. And this sometimes contradicted the need to adopt and adapt to American customs and values. Because most of the picture brides had left Korea at a very young age, many found themselves singularly unprepared to acquit themselves in a satisfactory manner. Illustrative is the following exchange between a young picture bride and an older Korean man who angrily berated her. Quote, "Don't you know how to dress an older person in a respectful way?" Unquote. She answered, quote, "Sir, I'm sorry for not knowing the proper way of speaking to an older person. Since I came to Hawaii as a picture bride when I was 16, I haven't had the chance to learn proper manners. Please forgive my ignorance and impoliteness. Please teach me the proper way of addressing an old man." Indeed, the arrival of the picture brides into Hawaiian society at an early age did result in the transformation of their language along Western lines and a gradual abandonment of traditional status-based usage. Edong J. at the University of Hawaii did research showing that picture brides tended to adopt more egalitarian usage in address, using terms such as Mr. or Mrs. plus the surname, using the word you, and addressing others by their first or given name. Consequently, they tended to abandon traditional address terms, including the deferential suffix him, or the use of a surname plus a title. This egalitarianism also resulted in the disappearance of speech-level differences between husband and wife, making them linguistically and socially more equal, as opposed to the gender-based traditional Korean superiority of males over females. The longer the picture brides were in Hawaii, American values increasingly won out over Korean values. The evidence suggests that many of these picture bride unions did not conform to the usual parameters of married life. For those picture brides who stayed with their older husbands, their relationship was more often based upon notions of filial piety than on love. One picture bride addressed her husband as Abaji, or father. Another recalled, quote, "I found then that he was 46 years old. He was more like a father than my husband, and he did treat me more like a daughter." Unquote. Another one said, quote, "My husband being 30 years my senior, I definitely looked upon him more as my father than my husband. I do not ever recall hearing or using the word love between us. Life was so dry and routine that any sort of warm feelings were simply out of the question." Unquote. At worst, these marriages were often marred by mutual recrimination, the wife feeling that she had been tricked, and the husband feeling that the women did not appreciate the expense involved in bringing them to Hawaii. Such marriages did not begin well, such as the one in which, after the wedding, quote, "we didn't talk to each other for 3 months, living together in the same house," unquote. Many of these marriages remained on shaky ground. As one field researcher in the 1930s candidly admitted, quote, "Many of the picture bride marriages have turned out not too happily," unquote, with the picture brides expressing their resentment through bickering and shrewishness, unquote. From this, a pattern developed in which some households were dominated by the younger picture brides. Such domination was made possible because the women discovered that they enjoyed several advantages. One, of course, was their relative views. A second was that after exposure to the American ideal of personal happiness and freedom, they began to question the traditional subservience to the husband and the stigma against divorce, seeing divorce as a possible avenue of escape from an unhappy marriage. And a third advantage that the picture brides enjoyed over their husbands was that there were still many single Korean men in Hawaii. These factors led not only to female domination, but also to many divorces and near divorces, most of which, 90%, were initiated by women. But unhappy marriages were not the only problems facing these couples. Most of the marriages had begun in a situation of severe financial constraint. As bad luck would have it, just as some of these newly formed families were beginning to get on their feet financially after a decade in Hawaii, the Depression struck in 1929, throwing the picture brides and their children and husband into an economic tailspin. Another problem associated with the picture bride phenomenon was the harsh reality that the men, as husbands and fathers, would soon be physically unable to provide for their families and unable to look forward to enjoying a normal retirement. Because the men had become fathers so late in life, they could not retire as they traditionally did at the Hwagam at age 60 because their young children, still growing and going to school, were not yet in a position to support them in their old age. Oftentimes, the picture brides had to pick up the slack and support the family. An even worse actuarial consequence for the families was the prospect that the picture brides would become widowed at a relatively early age. And since many had had a large number of children, the widow would have to support a large family by herself. One mitigating factor for the picture bride widowed at an early age was the fact that there were many opportunities for remarriage because the number of eligible men was still greater than the number of eligible women. While the life of many of the picture brides was indeed difficult, their arrival between 1910 and 1924 marked an important milestone in the Korean community in Hawaii. They helped begin the, quote, normalization, unquote, of the skewed gender ratio of the community, so that by the end of the 1920s, the Korean community in Hawaii was no longer predominantly a bachelor society. By the 1930s, the number of men and women was nearly equal up to the age of 24, as a result of the appearance of the second generation, while the abnormally skewed ratio of men over women was now relegated to those mostly over the age of 50. In fact, by 1930, a majority, 54% of the Koreans in Hawaii, were American citizens, having been born in the United States. The development of a more equal ratio between men and women and the appearance of the second generation was important because this promoted acculturation to American values. And the Koreans in Hawaii remained largely bachelors, like the Chinese in America, who were prevented from importing wives because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, there would have been no significant second generation, and the community would continue to be dominated by the values of the older, more traditional generation. Such would not be the case with the Koreans, as the specific gravity of the community would soon begin to shift to the more Americanized second generation. Another important legacy of the picture brides was the boost they gave to the Korean nationalist movement in Hawaii. No less nationalistic than their husbands, they could recount from first-hand experience the outrages committed by the Japanese in Korea, unlike their husbands who had left Korea before the protective and annexation. One man recalled that when he was a boy, his picture bride mother always reminded him to hate Japanese, telling him that one Korean equals him Japanese. One picture bride who was visiting her parents in Korea participated in the March 1st demonstrations in 1919 and was thrown in jail by the Japanese. On her way back to Hawaii in 1921, she was detained in Yokohama and again jailed for 2 months. Picture bride organizations like the Yungnam Pu and Wei, I think you saw a picture up there of them, the Yungnam Wives Society, also organized nationalist activities, inviting speakers on the Korean independence movement to speak at their church or at their meetings. One woman remembered the effect of such a speech by a singer from Korea on her picture bride mother. This was the first time my mother openly revealed her feelings about the plight of her people. So let me just conclude by saying that all this came to an end in 1924 with the passage of the Immigration Act of that year. Aimed primarily at the Japanese, it affected Koreans as well because Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.